So hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and joining me today to talk about navigating the murky areas where ethical, legal, and policy challenges present when measuring open source. For those who it helps, you can find these slides and detailed speaker notes at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/OSS-DRAGONS-SCIPY2023-slides. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet today. I acknowledge that we are standing on the ancestral homes of the Plains tribes, including the Lipan Apache, Comanche, and Takwa. I acknowledge the systemic elimination and forced expulsion of the indigenous peoples of Central Texas enabled the society of today that develop on these lands. Our community gathering now resides within this society, which was established on these taken lands, at the divestiture and suffering of indigenous peoples and the land itself. We pay respect to the people of the Plains tribes, past, present, and future. Some context about myself. I'm a pale white woman with light hair and eyes who wears glasses. I'm a researcher and engineer at Google, where I'm currently leading a team focused on research and education in our open source programs office. I'm also one of Google's co-leads for Project Ocean and Across. We'll talk about that a little bit today. External faculty for the Vermont Complex Systems Center, a co-founder of Open Source Stories with Julia Ferrioli. I sit on the board of directors for the Computational Democracy Project. I once wrote a book with Alice Zhang on feature engineering. I'm also queer, a very proud mama of two smaller humans, a US Navy veteran, and I'm lucky enough to currently live in the indomitable state of Vermont. Just take me a second. While I am fortunate enough to be here today, my state and hometown area is experiencing life-altering flooding as a direct result of human-accelerated climate change. If you want to learn more about what Vermont is experiencing and how you can help, the Vermont Public Radio consistently has the most accurate coverage and updates for our local communities and those who care about us. So for today, when we're talking about measuring open source, why are we here? Well, in 2019, I was working in Google Cloud as a developer relations engineering manager. I had an absolutely amazing team, but I also had this nagging feeling about the general understanding of how open source worked and how it was measured. Fortunately, many of my friends at Google are also frequent members of the Half Bakery of Ideas, and they love to introduce you to the friends you haven't met yet. So this is how I met Julia Ferrioli of the Open Source Programs Office. Together, we developed and pitched the idea for what would become Project Ocean, a pilot for the team for Open Source Programs Office and moving forward academic, industry, community, and research of open source at a global scale. Now, despite launching a new initiative in early 2020, which I don't recommend, looking back in hindsight, we were still able to achieve many of the goals we had, and the work continues today with a range of internal academic and community partners. One of our most audacious goals was mapping out the entire open source ecosystem and then sharing it with everybody. And honestly, at the time, it didn't feel that audacious. We're Google. We know how to organize information, make it accessible and useful. It should be easy with open source. But one of the first barriers we ran against, and we continue to run against still, is defining the problem space of open source with our stakeholders and the communities that we work with. So there are many mental models and analogies about open source that exist. Some of these models aid our understanding of a complex ecosystem. However, we found that we don't challenge these enough to truly investigate the risks and problems in open source now. So we are continually building for how we've been burned previously. We lack sufficient baselines to give true census to how many people are involved in open source, how many people are holding up our technical world, and where we might be at risk of the whole modern tech stack simply falling to the ground. So organizationally, for us, what this means is that we can't move forward effectively and sustainably until we break popular but over-reductionist models of modern digital infrastructure. So this XKCD comic is very frequently shown to demonstrate the gaps that exist in both our understanding and our failure to adequately respond to the challenge of shoring up open source. More often than not, it's used to show the brittleness of the open source ecosystem and why further large-scale investment is critical and is critical right now. My counter to this comic is that the reality, billions of dollars is spent already in open source in sustaining it globally, billions of dollars. The initial comic is used effectively to centralize buckets of money. It centralizes attention. It builds walls around organizational spaces for collaboration rather than breaking them down. It isn't that we are not investing. It's that we're making localized decisions about investment and support for open source while we lack a resilient way to approach a global, decentralized, inequitably resourced ecosystem. Black swans of open source past are cited frequently as the risk we will see happen again if we don't invest in a centralized initiative someone is proposing to you right now. Please get your money to sit at the table. This may be true, or it might be that despite any amount of investment or organization, the next problem will present itself in a way that will also only be clearly visible through hindsight. So this brings us to the impetus of mapping out open source ecosystems that Julie and I envisioned initially for Project Ocean. Quite simply, we are looking for that magic spot of any research which allows us to have better data and better models so that we can make better data-informed decisions. We're not looking to understand every single gap. We don't think that that's possible, but we do know that we need to make better decisions with the information we have now. We want to know where we are now so that we can work collectively in our communities to figure out where to go next. So along the way, with my many collaborators and colleagues, we frequently find ourselves in spots on the map where it's unclear. There's no clear policy or approach to navigating data or to an abstract representation of open source. So this is where cartographers frequently mark Thar dragons on their map. It's the fuzzy places that may hold danger or may hold treasure. Today, I'd like to walk through a few of these areas, specifically around ethical, legal, and policy challenges that we continue to navigate. As much as I'd like to have clear, well-lit paths for you to navigate these waters, I don't. I can share what I've learned, what we should talk about as a community, and what questions researchers can ask themselves when approaching the same challenge. And my hope is that together we continue to challenge assumptions, avoid the most harm, and find the best way forward each time we approach the home of a dragon. So first, let's explore some of the ethical challenges which arise when working within research about open source. One of the key cultural tenets of open source software and the communities that build around it is working in the open. This places much, but not all of the conversation about these communities online in a way that is visible to anyone who wants to join the effort. And that's the intent. The intent is to be open, to make work, community, and innovation transparent. There's a subset of our larger open source movement which identifies as free software, where free hinges on the concept of Libre rather than tied to a cost savings measure. This is a very different concept than open or free, meaning please scrape our data and tell us about ourselves. There's no universal consent form that any one person or community is signing up for when placing their information online. Yet this is how we have been advancing our knowledge of the problems that exist in open source and advocate for their resolution. So the ethical challenge here is when and where can we assume consent for online content to be analyzed? How can we even find and respect those barriers when they are so unclear? This brings us to the next ethical challenge, which primarily applies to folks working in institutions with IRBs. So for those not familiar, institutional review boards or IRBs review research studies to ensure that they comply with applicable regulations, meet commonly accepted ethical standards, follow institutional policies, and adequately protect research participants. So just as we talked about the lack of explicit consent to be a test subject in aggregate, there's also an institutional gap that many IRBs do not require review of analysis and research when it's conducted in aggregate from metadata. Even if the markers of the metadata could be potentially identifying, such as mailing list information, where email addresses and location data do not adequately provide anonymization, the individuals whose work is represented are not considered research participants for data which may already exist and is open to many. This brings the ethical challenge for us. When and how do we identify when a research study should be reviewed by IRB? And how do we advocate for that kind of oversight? When is it beneficial to the group being studied? When is it actually not a necessary step towards framing ethical research problems? The next piece in problem framing, humans are complex creatures. As much as it serves reducing the problem space, no one person readily sits in a single dimensional cluster. When we fail to recognize this, we are at risk of problem framing becoming too reductive. So we have to ask when and where are we actively erasing people or reducing their identities to vectors which become harmful when applied to policy. One for all is not all for one. We have to continue to be conscientious of categorization and reductionism of identities into single categories. In addition to this, and continuing on with the concept and challenge of self-identification markers, we must always be aware that people from vulnerable populations may and do intentionally separate their identities across multiple online communities and spaces. Now more than ever, we have to be aware of how our aggregated work may unintentionally place someone from a digital space into a place where they may physically be subject to real-world consequences because of who they are and how they exist in the world. Which brings us to a fundamental technique of working within open source research, when we are combining information across multiple trace systems to gain a more complete picture of a community is a common technique. For example, if we want to see how software changes over time, we may combine data from working software repositories, issue trackers, maintainer mailing lists. And since not every system identifier is the same, we use anti-aliasing methods to consolidate work across individuals. Here, I refer to anti-aliasing as sampling techniques to combine information to single identifiers. So the ethical challenge this brings is, does anti-aliasing across data sets potentially create opportunities for harm to members of open source communities? We talked before about how individuals may separate themselves across digital spaces. One of these specific separations is when a trans person who works in open source moves their work and digital identity as they come out as trans. They may not be able to change over all of their professional and community work from their dead name to their present identity. So when this is uncovered through inferred methods, how do we honor that person, their life, and who we have unintentionally outed beyond their original trusted community? So we're gonna pause on ethical challenges for now. I will give a moment of levity. I know these are pretty big topics. To wade into waters where lawyers hesitate to be cited. So as a quick note, this is a picture of a lawyer who accidentally used a Zoom filter to show themselves as a cat during a trial online in 2020. Now, I am not a lawyer and I am not a cat, but as any good lawyer, cat gets super fidgety when engineers talk about legal matters. I will not get into specifics today. I will generally refer to things about regulations and laws and other good ideas which maintain good social structure. Please consult your own lawyer cats as needed for further clarification, advice, and dark matters to avoid. So again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not your lawyer, but when I talk with lawyer cats about data, what is data, and where the law sees what is data, we get in some really interesting conversations. It really boils down to the fact there's no global legal standard on what is information, what is data, and what the differentiation is between data and a data set. Even more complex is that there's no universal legal standard on what data is, who that belongs to, what is public, what is open, and how we can apply that across all different use cases. This is most important because open source does not have physical boundaries. So when someone starts to ask you location data of where open source comes from or a maintainer comes from, there's no real answer for that. If anyone wants to try to separate out the kind of software or the kind of commits that are coming from specific global localities, it's not really a clear way to do that. But lawyers would like to see things like that happen because they want to be able to answer questions. But this is just to keep in mind when you see open data, you have to remember that open to use may not be open to us, depending on who that us is, who's asking the question, what's the affiliation that you have as a part of that, what computer systems you're working on, what internet you're using to access that information. All of these can influence whether or not that data is available to you to either do research, commercial or otherwise. Yes, Amanda, you may say, but what about this concept I hear about in copyright law, which refers to fair use? Again, this is not standardized across every country, institution, organization, or industry. Very excitingly, the most recent advances in text generation and summarization have revisited and accelerated the challenges to what exactly constitutes fair use. So if you want to give your favorite intellectual property lawyer cat a headache, ask them what's currently changing or up for change in legislation, regulation, and case law regarding fair use and large language models. I've included in the references section one recent viewpoint from Van Lindbergh, who wrote a book on intellectual property and open source, if you're interested in that. This is specifically about US law. So in the meantime, there's licensing standards that exist and are used by open source communities to explain how you can use the information they post online. Where we get into legal challenges here is what license apply, where, and for what use. So open source software, by definition, falls under licenses as outlined by the open source definition. However, metadata about this software, the data exhaust created by platforms they use, proprietary or otherwise, and the licenses which may apply to the data they use can all be different. They can all be not the same. So in addition, some information that depends on use, is it commercial or non-commercial use, what you're using with it. Some depends on explicit licensing or what means when there's no license attached at all. and data was created by a citizen of a different country, these can all influence where and how you're available to use things and which licenses layer on top of each other. Eliminating the step of untangling these license and use cases is not optional. You can't skip it when you're trying to design a research problem and move things forward. There's more, but just to help keep moving the discussion forward, we've talked about ethical and legal challenges, which are the necessary building blocks to begin to address where policy challenges present themselves when researching open source communities. So, one widely used governance model within open source is to have larger foundations shepherd projects and portfolios for open source maintainers. This enables them to offload some of the work when maintaining a globally used technology project. However, this brings us back to the problem of aggregated consent and individual consent when working with data about people. When communities choose to work with larger foundations, when does that foundation begin to represent the individuals and collective groups within? What happens when that foundation may start to move away from a collective sense or from a minoritized or marginalized group within the community itself? What do communities give up when they join a larger organization? What do they retain? Who ultimately gets to make those decisions? Can foundations sign up projects and maintainers for larger initiatives? Research studies, right? So some foundations sign up with individual researchers. They get paid money or they pay money. And then researchers have access to the entire ecosystem that foundation is working within. All of the issue trackers, all of the mailing lists, all of the repositories, all of the discussion points. They get access to all of that data, which may otherwise be closed off for access by API or otherwise. Can foundations change whether or not do you get to have a say in that when you're a member of that community, or do they have ultimate rights? Can foundations change mandatory communication and operational platforms, terms and conditions without the consent of individual maintainer communities? I filed this under policy because we may not always be aware of what visibility and privacy we are signing when we sign commitments when joining larger organizations, regardless of good intent. So what do we require of marginalized people in our community when that organization ethically drifts away from their best interest? Do they have to bring themselves out and their identities forward in order to confront those changes in a way that they otherwise would not choose to bring them forward? And it's kind of a point to move forward, and hopefully a little bit of hope and optimism. This all culminates into how we can create community consent models, right? Care of the commons. So can we think about creating and working together in a way that allows for people who create the data to have the most control over how it is used? To have access to it, and for what purposes. Platforms, public and private, commercial and non-commercial, all impact what community chooses to use and how they ultimately place additional policy and conditions on their members in a way that their members can or cannot agree to. And making clear choices about this when you are transparently moving systems is a good way that you can care for your community. So as researchers, this returns us to the fundamental concept of building with and not for. Every open source project is part of a larger socio-technical ecosystem. We can't ignore the people for the bits. So when we want to start scraping APIs and we want to start scraping pages and accessing APIs and downloading bulk information to answer our research question, we have to think about what was the intent of the community when they moved there and whether or not that's something that they signed up for. So while these challenges have not been solved in the last 25 minutes, I do want to offer some tools to help move open source research and understanding forward. Absolutely shameless self-promotion. Together with Julia Ferrioli and Juniper Lovato, we recently published a set of best practices for open source researchers. We cover recommendations in the areas of data ethics, research best practices, respect and equity considerations, and how to approach ecosystem integrity while avoiding reductionist thinking. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good starting point. If you have an appetite for a book, a little less than, a paper wasn't enough, my first recommendation remains Data Feminism, the 2020 book by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein. It's expert, nuanced, and highly critical of their own methods, which I always appreciate. If one book isn't enough, V.M. Brasseur book, Forge Your Future with Open Source, will give you a deeper understanding of how the open source community works, how it's grown over time, where practitioners are present, and what kind of workflows they share online and why. This is about why do we use the systems that we do and what the intent is behind it. This isn't a book to teach you about research best practices, but rather about how to teach you how open source is the way it is now, and where you can meet ecosystems where they are. And of course, if that's not enough, the breadth and depth search through all of these references will pile up your paper pile even quicker than I can lay them out in a slide. So to end and leave some time for questions, I just want to encourage you to keep asking yourself and each other the hard questions about how we design problems, what data we collect, and the conclusions that we draw and present when we talk about these ecosystems. After all, we're all in this open source raft together. Thanks. Any questions from the room? No.
Thank you for this talk. One of the things that you talked about was co-designing with communities, and my question is around, like, how do you co-design a community who has shifting norms, right? Like, if you look at the history of like open source, and even if you look at the history of this conference, right, the demographics have shifted and our norms are changing. And so how do you design like to like kind of target like where the community will be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that, so I think any community that has a documented governance model has presented a way that they want you to interact with them, right? So if they have nominated or voted leadership, if they have mechanisms for describing who makes decisions in an organization, that's always a good place to start, because that's where communities are telling you where and how they make decisions and the processes that they use to move forward. So I think respecting those governance patterns is always a first place. With that, I think being aware of the fact that any community also outside of the governance mechanisms probably has soft power happening within it. And that will not always be visible to an outsider. So I think part of my recommendation for that is that you can either choose to then become engaged in the community and lose your distance from it to start to understand where that's happening at, to be able to react and honor where that power is or is not happening based on who feels comfortable having a voice, or to start seeing where that might actually be a place that is not going to be possible to move forward with that kind of method. I don't think that every community and every project necessarily is in a mature or robust state where they can maybe think about forward planning beyond the next few months. And trying to ask that of them is also not honoring the work that they're putting in. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think the design problem is hard. And so I think it's for me, it's always approaching first is where are you telling me you want to be worked with?
Any more questions from the room?
Fantastic talk. The Chaos Project. I have concerns about it, and my concerns are how it impacts underrepresented groups. Any thoughts on how to use that data responsibly?
Yeah, so I actually had this written down here and I forgot to bring it up in the policy discussion. So for those of folks who aren't aware, I don't remember what's happened, it was a few weeks ago or not. So the Python Packaging Index was subpoenaed by the US government and asked for information. We don't have they published a transparency report, making sure to try to tell their community the best that they could of what information they were forced to release. And they also changed their data policies based on that subpoena. So I appreciate and understand that the only way that we can move forward in understanding how underrepresented, marginalized, and minoritized populations in our communities show up, are present, and supported is to count them. But then What happens with that next is absolutely something that we then become responsible for. This is where I don't have clear answers for you, Carol, on on data retention. One method for this is after collection and surveys are done, is that you destroy all of the raw data and you only keep the aggregated and anonymized report. And you don't retain the rest of it. And basically, your year-over-year tracking is only going to happen based on those aggregated and anonymized models. I do struggle with the fact, too, that with a lack of no baseline of really understanding that population data year over year, that it's still very hard to track individual points as well. So I applaud the localized methods of trying to create better data around what's happening in communities. And I also think every one of those surveys and data retention, you really have to start red teaming what's the worst case that happened if this data set becomes public. Because that's the world we live in now. Maybe we always did. Some countries always lived like this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see one more question.
Hi, thanks. I work in academic research, and the perspectives on ethical consent are broad among the people I work with. Your lens seems to be one of being as ethical as possible, and that's certainly not the consensus among academics now. I think it's more, how can we conform to the legal policies?
Sure.
So I guess my question is, where do you see that evolving, and kind of what advice or perspectives do you have for people that are not necessarily trying to be as fully ethical as they can about things like consent, of being included in studies, things like that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So actually, my co-author for the best practices paper, Junior Lovato, is defending her PhD on data ethics. So she has been studying for years now the intersection between data, philosophy, and ethics. One of her recent papers at ACM Fact was analyzing, I don't remember how many privacy policies, and just trying to understand overlap, consent. So I think that from working with her and from working with other colleagues that work in the academic sense, I understand where you're saying that there can and is a gap between data that exists and data you create. This is why I brought up the IRB board, right? And so I think in terms of trying to figure out where either personally or you are able to influence ethics within either your sphere or your department, some of that for me comes down to where we change policies, right? So where either as a departmental policy, where you start to ask questions or work with each other on like, what is it that is or is not required within your field? Working on program committees as a part of publication efforts and changing program committee requirements actually does a lot. Because when you start to change the bar on what is allowed to be submitted into academic publishing, you're changing that for a much wider group of people. So I think for me, it's recognizing the mechanisms and the constraints that exist within your field, your department, and your wider global area, and seeing where is it that adding on additional either requirements or additional, even if it's just a notification or clarification and transparency, that can make big scale change. So I think that the Mining Software Repositories Conference with ICSE is a long-running conference and publication. That's one place to start, is when accepted papers have data from different places, what are the requirements that we have on that research? Does that answer your question? Okay.
I would like to thank our speaker again.